To create a string in Python, enclose text and quotation marks. On the screen, you will see that the variable called string variable is assigned the string of 7, S-E-V-E-N. Numbers in Python require no such special treatment. When you want to use a number, simply include it in your source code. To assign the number 7 to the variable called number variable, simply supply the number 7 without any quotation marks. If you were to place the number 7 in quotation marks, it is not a number. It's actually a string at that point. This is important because if you try to perform a mathematical operation against a string, you're going to encounter an error. I'll show you how to deal with that in just a moment. Python supports integers as well as floating point numbers. Integers are whole numbers, or numbers without a decimal point. Floating point numbers always contain a decimal point. The Python interpreter can perform several operations with numbers. This table lists the most commonly used numeric operations. Use the plus sign to perform addition, a hyphen or a dash to perform subtraction. Use an asterisk to perform multiplication. I want to point out that if you add, subtract, or multiply an integer with a floating point number, the result will always be a floating point number. The division operator, or a /, performs floating point division and will always return a floating point number. The exponentiation operator is 2 asterisks. Exponentiation means to raise to the power of. For example, 2 followed by the exponentiation operator, followed by 4, means 2 raised to the power of 4. This is equivalent to 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 and results in 16. The percent sign performs the modulo operation, which returns the remainder of division of one number by another. For example, 3 modulo 2 is 1 because 3 divided by 2 is 1 with a remainder of 1. 4 modulo 2 results in 0 since 4 divided by 2 is 2 with a remainder of 0. If you try to perform a mathematical operation against a string, you will encounter an error. Remember that if you surround a number in quotes, it becomes a string. To convert a string or a float into an integer, use the built-in int function. Simply pass in the string or float that you would like to convert to int. Also, to convert a string or an integer into a floating point number, use the float function. Let's look at some examples. To use a number in Python, simply put the number in your source code. If you surround the number in quotes, it becomes a string. So this is not the same as this. Let's assign a number to a variable. Let's use a variable name called this. And in Python, if you want to check the type or a class of an object, including a variable, you can pass it to the built-in type function. So we'll type int var. And you can see that it is an int, or an integer. Let's use some floating point numbers here. Type float var returns float, so it's a floating point number. Let's do another example here. Remember, when you enclose something in quotation marks, it becomes a string. We can use the Python interpreter as a calculator. Let's just do some simple math here. And remember, if you use a floating point number with an integer, a floating point number is going to be returned. Let's do some subtraction, multiplication. 8 divided by 2 is 4, but when you're using division, a floating point number will be returned. So in actuality, the value you will get back is a 4.0. And there you see 4.0 was returned. Let's raise 2 to the power of 4, and that is 16. Let's find the remainder of 3 divided by 2, and that is 1. 3 modulo 2 is 1. Let's see what happens when you try to perform a mathematical operation on a string. That is an integer, and this is a string. you see that an error is returned. You can't add an integer to a string. You will run into this type of situation if, for example, you are accepting input from a user because that input will always come in the form of a string. You'll need to convert it to an integer or a float so that you can use it as a number if that's what you want to do. So to convert a string to an integer, let's use the int built-in function. And that returns a 3. So let's do this. Total equals quantity plus the integer value of quantity string. And that results in 6 as you would expect. You can also convert a string or an integer into a floating point number using the built-in float function. Let's do that right now. Let's create a simple Python program using some of the things we've covered today. Let's assume that you are planning to use your Python skills to build a social networking service, and you decide to host your application on servers that run in the cloud. The hosting provider that you pick charges 51 cents an hour. You will launch your service using one server, and you want to know how much it will cost you to operate for 1 day, and also how much it's going to cost you to operate that server for 1 month. So let's write a quick Python program to answer those questions. We know that the cost of one server per hour is 51 cents. The first line I have here on the screen is a comment. It begins with a hash sign, or some people call it a number sign. And that is just for the benefit of us humans when we're reading the source code of the program. Python is not going to operate on that in any way. I'm just putting this here as a note to myself. So let's assign this value to a variable, cost per hour. And we want to calculate the costs for one server. So cost per day would be 24 hours in a day times the cost per hour. And then the cost per month would be 30 days times the cost per day. Let's display the results to the screen. And let's do cost per day. Oh, looks like I have some sort of error. Okay, need a decimal point right here. And close out my print statement with another parentheses. Okay, that looks good. We'll do cost per month. We'll use, 2 decimal places in this floating point number. Cost per month. Let's save our file and let's run and see what we have. There we go. Our cost per day is $12.24, and the cost per month to operate our server is $367.20. Let's review what we've talked about today. We learned that numbers require no special decoration, unlike strings, which you have to enclose in quotes. And if you do happen to place a number inside of a quote, it actually becomes a string. If you want to convert a floating point number or a string to an integer, use the Python built-in int function. Likewise, to convert an integer or a string to a floating point number, use the float function.